My husband died in his mistress's apartment, and 3 days later, his own mother tried to charge the funeral deposit to my card like she still owned me. 3 days after my husband died, his mother handed the funeral director my credit card like she owned it. She'd already picked the $12,000 casket, gold trim, catering for 150 people who didn't even like Sean. Only the best for my boy, she said, dabbing dry eyes with a tissue she never used. I let her talk. I always let her talk, but I can't start there. I have to start in a hospital hallway. 4 days earlier, at 11:40 on a Thursday night, a nurse stopped me before I reached the ICU doors. She had a clipboard pressed to her chest like a shield. "Are you Elena, Sean's wife?" "Yes. Where is he?" She lowered her voice the way people do right before they hand you something heavy. "He didn't come in alone. He collapsed at a woman's apartment. She rode with him in the ambulance." My stomach dropped straight through the floor. I told myself it was a coworker, a client, anyone but the truth sitting right there in her sentence. Then I walked into the waiting room and saw her, a woman in a wrinkled blouse, sitting beside my mother-in-law Gwen, like she'd sat there 100 times before. Their shoulders were touching. Gwen's hand rested on the woman's knee. Nobody introduced her. Nobody had to. "Finally," Gwen said, when she saw me cross the room. Not, "I'm sorry." Not, "Are you okay?" Finally, like I was late to my own husband's death. At 4 in the morning, a doctor with tired eyes told us Sean was gone. Massive cardiac event. Nothing anyone could have done, he said, like that was supposed to help. Gwen cried into the stranger's shoulder. My father-in-law, Howard, pressed his palm flat against the waiting room window and didn't move for a long time. Tyler, Sean's younger brother, sat with his head in his hands. Nobody looked at me. Not once. I remember the small things from that room more clearly than I remember most of the last decade. The vending machine humming in the corner. A child's drawing taped crooked to the wall, left over from some pediatric wing down the hall. The particular way Gwen's necklace caught the fluorescent light every time she leaned into that stranger's shoulder, like even her grief needed an audience angle. I stood by the door because no one made room for me anywhere else. The woman in the wrinkled blouse never gave me her name. She was gone before the sun came up, slipping out through the automatic doors while a chaplain was still talking to Gwen about arrangements. I found her name myself 2 days later, Vivian. And by the time I found it, I'd already found everything else. I work in mortgage compliance. 14 years at Heritage Bank, reading documents for the lies people bury inside them. Forged signatures, backdated disclosures, numbers that don't add up if you know where to look. It's the only skill I have that matters, and for 14 years I used it on strangers' paperwork. I never once turned it on my own house. That night back home, alone in the bed we'd shared for 10 years, I opened the tablet Sean never bothered to log out of. I told myself I only wanted to look at his photos. One last version of him before the funeral turned him into something else. The first picture in the shared album wasn't of Sean and me. It was Sean at a restaurant I didn't recognize, and a woman's hand with red painted nails resting on his shoulder like it belonged there. Vivian. I sat on the bathroom floor and read messages until the sky went gray outside the window. Hotel receipts from 3 different cities, a conference in Denver that had landed him 20 minutes from our own house on our anniversary, while I ate dinner alone at the restaurant we always went to, and told myself work was just work. 2.5 years. That's how long it had been going on. 2.5 years of birthday cards and grocery runs, and me asking him more than once if everything was okay, and him saying yes, of course, why wouldn't it be? Then I found the group chat. Gwen, Howard, Tyler, Vivian, 22 months of birthday wishes and dinner plans, right there in a thread named Simply Us. My Thanksgiving table, discussed and scheduled around a woman I'd never met, seated at a satellite restaurant table 2 blocks from my in-laws' house so the timing would work out. Every single one of them knew. Every single one of them sat across from me at that table and passed the mashed potatoes and knew. And then I found a message from Gwen to Sean, sent 3 months before he died. "Don't touch the joint accounts yet. Let her think everything's fine. She'll sign anything if you're sweet about it. She always has." I read it 4 times. Then I understood. This wasn't just an affair his family had quietly tolerated. They were planning my exit, all of them together, for longer than I wanted to think about. I didn't scream. I didn't call my sister or my best friend or anyone. I sat very still on that bathroom floor until the shock burned off and something colder took its place. Then I got quiet and I got to work. To understand how I got to that funeral home, you have to understand what we were before any of this. Sean and I met at Ohio State junior year, both of us broke and half asleep in an 8 a.m. accounting class neither of us wanted to take. He made me laugh during a lecture on depreciation schedules, which is a low bar, but it worked. He used to walk me back to my dorm the long way, past the river, just to keep talking a little longer. He wasn't polished back then. He wore the same green jacket for 2 winters straight and drove a Civic with a passenger door that only opened from the inside. I liked that version of him. I liked him before his mother's money ever touched anything we built. We got married when I was 26 and he was 28 in a backyard in Dublin, Ohio, with folding chairs and a caterer his mother insisted on paying for. I remember standing at the top of the aisle, my own father's arm under mine, and catching Gwen's eye before the music even started. She wasn't looking at Sean. She was looking at the seating chart in her lap, moving place cards with her thumb like she was still deciding who deserved to be close to the altar. I told myself that was just Gwen being Gwen. Detail-oriented. A woman who liked things done right. That should have been my first warning. Gwen didn't give gifts. She gave leverage. The Cabots were Dublin royalty in the small, specific way that only exists in Italian town of 60,000 people who all went to the same 3 churches. Howard's father had started Cabot & Sons construction in the 70s, building the strip malls and subdivisions that turned farmland into suburbs. By the time I met the family, Howard ran it, Gwen kept the books, and Sean worked project management out of the same beige office building his grandfather had built. Gwen ran that family like a company with one shareholder, herself. She had a way of turning ordinary Sunday dinners into performance reviews. She'd ask about my job in a tone that made it sound like a hobby I'd eventually grow out of. She'd bring up Tyler's latest business idea, something that never quite launched, and praise his vision. While I sat there having just closed a 7-figure compliance audit nobody at that table ever asked me about. Sean used to squeeze my knee under the table during those dinners, a small apology he never said out loud. For years, that squeeze was enough for me. I didn't need the table's approval as long as I had his. Howard rarely said much at those dinners. He'd nod along, refill wine glasses, laugh at the right moments. I used to think he was simply quiet by nature. It took me a decade to understand that quiet, in that house, was its own kind of currency, and Howard had learned long ago that spending it on disagreement with Gwen never paid off. 3 years into our marriage, when we bought our first house on Larchmere Court, Gwen wrote us a check for $40,000 toward the down payment. She handed it to Sean at Sunday dinner, in front of his father and brother, and said, loud enough for the whole table, "This is so you two never have to worry. Family takes care of family." I thanked her. I meant it at the time. "You'll want to keep the receipts organized," she added, still holding the check for a half-second longer than she needed to before letting it go, "in case anything ever happens. You never know with marriages these days." She said it lightly, like a joke, and everyone at the table laughed except me. I laughed too, a beat late, because I hadn't understood yet that it wasn't a joke at all. It was a warning wearing a smile, the first of many I'd failed to recognize until I already knew how to read one. I didn't understand yet that in Gwen's accounting, gratitude was a debt that never fully cleared. For a while, though, none of that mattered much, because the marriage itself was good in the ordinary, unglamorous ways that don't make for interesting stories. Sean learned to make my grandmother's pot roast recipe because I mentioned once in passing that I missed it. We had a standing Friday night ritual of cheap wine and whatever terrible reality show was airing that season, the two of us on the couch making fun of the contestants until midnight. He used to leave for work early enough that he'd bring me coffee in bed first, setting it on the nightstand without waking me. A small, quiet kindness I only fully appreciated once it had been gone for over a year without my noticing exactly when it stopped. I think about that most, actually. Not the big betrayal, the small vanished coffee cup, and how long it took me to register its absence. The early red flag came 4 years ago, when we refinanced the house to lower our rate. Gwen offered to help coordinate with the title company since she knew the loan officer from church. I let her because refusing felt petty. Then I found the draft paperwork on the kitchen counter one night and saw her name typed into a field marked additional title holder. I remember standing in the kitchen holding those pages, waiting for Sean to come home from work, running the whole conversation in my head before he'd even parked the car. When he walked in, I set the papers on the counter without a word and watched his face for the answer before he gave me one. "It's probably a clerical error," he said, barely glancing down. "Mom wouldn't try anything like that. Her name is typed into the title field, Sean. Typed. That's not a clerical error. That's a form somebody filled out on purpose." He rubbed the back of his neck, the way he always did when he wanted a conversation to be over before it had really started. "I'll call her," he said. He never did, as far as I know. I believed him anyway, mostly, because believing him was easier than the alternative. I called the title company myself the next morning and had the field removed before signing. I never told Gwen I'd caught it. I just quietly closed the door she'd tried to walk through. She knew, though. Mothers like Gwen always know when a door's been shut on them, even if nobody says a word. From that point forward, something in the way she looked at me changed. Warmer on the surface, colder underneath. She started calling me sweetheart, in a tone that had nothing sweet in it. Sean and I tried for a baby starting the year after that. 2 pregnancies, both lost before either one got a name spoken out loud in front of anyone but me and him. 9 weeks the first time, 14 weeks the second. I remember the second one most clearly. An ordinary Tuesday, a scan room that was too cold, a technician who went quiet in a way that told me everything before she said a word. Sean held my hand in the car afterward and didn't say much, which was, in its own way, the right thing to do. For about a week, it felt like something had actually cracked open between his family and mine, some shared grief that might finally make Gwen see me as something other than an obstacle. It didn't last. Gwen never once asked how I was doing after either loss. Not a phone call, not a card. She asked Sean, in front of me, at a dinner 3 weeks after the second one, if maybe we should look into other options, like I was a car that had failed to start twice and needed replacing. I sat there with my hands in my lap and said nothing, because I'd learned by then that defending myself at that table only ever gave her more to work with. I told myself that was grief talking. I told myself a lot of things. There was one more moment, looking back, that I should have paid closer attention to. About 3 years ago, at a Cabot & Sons holiday party at a rented banquet hall downtown, I remember a woman in a green dress laughing a little too easily at something Sean said near the bar, her hand landing briefly on his forearm before she moved on to another conversation. I didn't think much of it at the time. Company parties are full of people being friendlier than they'd normally be, loosened by 2 free drinks and a DJ playing songs everyone half remembers the words to. I only thought of her again 18 months later, scrolling through the tablet on that bathroom floor floor when I recognized the same laugh in a video Sean had saved from a weekend I'd thought he spent at a job site in Toledo. By the time Sean died, we'd been married 10 years, and for at least 2.5 of them, he'd been building a second life 20 minutes from the one we shared. Looking back now, I can see exactly where it started to rot. I just didn't want to smell it while I still lived inside the house. The escalation started the morning after I found the tablet, and it happened in careful, deliberate steps, each one worse than the last, each one delivered with a smile. Step 1 was quiet, and it was mine. Monday morning, before the funeral home appointment, before anyone in that family had eaten breakfast, I logged into our joint accounts from my laptop at the kitchen table. I removed Gwen as an authorized user on the credit card Sean had added her to 2 years earlier for family expenses that had somehow, over time, become her expenses. I closed the joint checking account we'd never actually needed joint for. I called the insurance company and pulled Howard's name off the truck policy Sean had quietly kept paying for. I dropped Tyler's cell phone line, the one Sean had been covering since Tyler's temporary gap between jobs stretched into its 3rd year. I didn't tell anyone. I just did it. The way I'd close a file with a problem buried inside it. Cleanly, without drama. My hands were steady the whole time, which surprised me. 14 years of reading other people's disasters for a living had apparently taught me how to sit inside my own without shaking. I made a spreadsheet, the same way I'd make one for a client's loan file. Columns for account, action taken, and timestamp. It felt less like revenge and more like triage. Stop the bleeding first. Ask questions later. Step 2 came that same night. Gwen showed up at my door with her car still running in the driveway, headlights cutting across the front porch. "I need Sean's things," she said, not bothering with hello. "His laptop, the tablet, a mother deserves that. Everything's with my attorney," I told her, which wasn't true yet, but would be true by morning. I closed the door before she could argue. Through the frosted glass panel beside the door, I watched her shape stand there for almost a full minute before she turned and walked back to her car. She didn't leave right away. She sat in the driveway with the engine running and the headlights aimed at the house, like she was waiting for me to change my mind and come back out. I stood in the dark hallway and watched her shadow until she finally pulled away. She called 11 times that night. I didn't answer any of them. Somewhere around call number 7, she left a voicemail that started with, "Elena, sweetheart, I really don't think you understand what you're doing to this family," and I deleted it without finishing it, because I'd already started keeping a folder for things like that too. Step 3 was the gaslighting, and it came dressed as concern. Gwen called my sister-in-law's cousin, a woman named Patty from church who I'd met twice, and told her I was not handling things well, that I'd shut the whole family out, that grief was making me erratic. Patty called me directly, gently, to check on me, and I realized in that phone call that Gwen was building a story before I'd even decided what mine was going to be. "Gwen's just worried about you," Patty said, her voice careful, the voice of someone who genuinely believed she was doing a kindness. "She says you won't return calls, that you've cut Howard's insurance off, of all things, in the middle of all this." "I'm not trying to upset anyone," I told her. "I found out my husband had another relationship for 2.5 years. His family knew the whole time. I'm handling that." Patty went quiet on the phone in a way that told me the story Gwen had been telling didn't include that detail at all. "I didn't know that part," she finally said, quiet now, careful in a different way. "Nobody told me that part." "No," I said. "I imagine they wouldn't." By the end of that week, I stopped answering calls from numbers I didn't recognize, because I understood that every one of them might be another version of that same conversation. Gwen's story arriving a half step ahead of mine, again and again, to anyone who would listen. Step 4 was money and health, both at once, because Gwen never used one weapon when she could use 2. She called me directly this time, voice trembling in a way I no longer trusted. "Your father-in-law had chest pains last night," she said. "The stress of you cutting us off like this, Elena. He's 67. Do you want to be responsible for what happens to him?" I called Howard myself, separately, and he answered sounding perfectly fine, mildly confused about why I was checking on him. "Chest pains?" he said. "No, I feel fine, Elena. Had my cardiologist appointment just last month. Everything checked out." A pause and then, quieter, almost to himself. "Your mother-in-law does worry, though, about all sorts of things." I thanked him and hung up, and stood in my kitchen for a long time after that, turning the conversation over. That was the moment I understood Gwen wasn't just protecting herself. She was constructing a case, brick by brick, in case she needed one later, stacking small dishonesties into something that might one day look, from a distance, like the truth. Step 5 was the cruelest, and it came 2 days before the funeral, over the phone, her voice syrup-sweet the way it got right before she said something designed to bleed. "Maybe," she said, "if you'd given him what he needed at home, he wouldn't have gone looking for it somewhere else. A family, children, some warmth, Elena." I stood in my kitchen holding the phone and thought about 2 hospital rooms, 2 dates I never say out loud, and the fact that this woman had never once asked how I was after either one. I didn't cry. I'd used up my tears somewhere around 3 in the morning, 2 days earlier, on a bathroom floor. "I'm going to go now, Gwen," I said, and I hung up. Step 6 happened in public, at the viewing, the night before the funeral, and it was the moment I stopped being able to pretend this was only a private family matter. The funeral home had set up 2 rows of seating at the front of the room, reserved for immediate family. I walked in a few minutes late, having sat in my car in the parking lot gathering the nerve to go inside, and found Vivian sitting in the second row. Not in the back, not off to the side. 2 seats down from Gwen, in a black black dress, accepting condolences from people who clearly had no idea who she was. I stood in the doorway for a moment, and Gwen caught my eye across the room. She didn't look away. She didn't even look uncomfortable. She simply held my gaze, daring me, the way you dare a child to make a scene in a room full of adults. I walked straight to the front row instead, sat down in the seat that should have been mine, and said nothing to Vivian at all. I didn't need to make the scene Gwen was hoping for. I understood, watching Gwen's jaw tighten from 3 feet away, that my silence cost her more than any outburst would have. She'd wanted a fight she could describe later as my instability. I gave her nothing to describe. Afterward, in the parking lot, Howard caught up to me before I reached my car. I didn't know she was going to seat her there, he said, low, glancing back at the building. I want you to know that. I believed him mostly, though by then I'd learned that believing Howard and trusting Howard were two very different things. Looking back, I've noticed something about those weeks that I didn't fully understand while I was living through them. Every single step Gwen took was designed to provoke a reaction big enough to use against me later. A scene, a shout, a slammed phone, anything she could describe afterward as instability. I never gave her one. I answered every escalation with a closed account, a locked door, a single flat sentence, and nothing more. It wasn't restraint for its own sake. It was the same instinct that had kept me employed for 14 years. The understanding that the calmest person in the room is usually the one whose version of events survives. Somewhere in the middle of all of it, while I was combing through Sean's email looking for anything that might explain the accounts, I found something I didn't understand yet. A thread from 14 months back between Sean and someone named R. Castellano at a company called Ridgeline Mutual. Subject line, beneficiary update, policy confirmation. I skimmed it. I didn't recognize the policy number. It wasn't the group life insurance through Cabot & Sons that I'd always known about, the one that named me as beneficiary. I filed it away in my head as strange and moved on, because I had a funeral to survive first, and I didn't yet know that strange thread was the one that would end up mattering more than anything else in that whole ugly year. The funeral home appointment was Wednesday. Walnut conference table, the smell of lilies pumped in through some kind of diffuser, Gwen sitting across from me with a binder tabbed and color-coded like she was planning a wedding instead of burying her son. She'd chosen the mahogany casket with the gold trim, full floral packages for both the viewing and the service. Catering for 150 people, most of whom I happened to know, hadn't spoken to Sean in years. The funeral director ran the total, $23,000. Gwen slid my credit card across the table like it had always belonged to her. The machine beeped, declined. She ran it again, brow furrowing, fingers tapping the table, declined. Her smile cracked for exactly 1 second before she caught it and rebuilt it. There's obviously a mistake, she said, laughing lightly, glancing around the table for an ally. My daughter-in-law is good for it. Then, to me, sweet as poison. Tell him, sweetheart. I stood up slowly. There's no mistake, Gwen. I closed every account Monday morning. That card stopped being yours at 9:41 a.m. The room went very quiet. The funeral director's pen stopped moving. I opened the folder I'd brought and set it on the table between the flower catalog and the casket brochure. Vivian, I said, 2.5 years. Hotel receipts from 3 cities. Your group chat, Gwen? Your heart emoji on her photo. March 14th. Howard stared at the table like he could burn a hole through it. Tyler had gone the color of the tablecloth. And this, I said, flipping to the last page. She'll sign anything if you're sweet about it. You wrote that to your son, Gwen. About me. Her voice came out low, almost a hiss. You would do this to his memory? He stopped being my husband 2.5 years ago, I said. Everyone at this table knew before I did. I turned to the funeral director. Am I obligated to pay for any of this? No, ma'am, he said gently, already reaching for a different folder. Whoever signs, pays. I picked up my folder and looked at Gwen one last time before I left. You didn't lose a son on Thursday, Gwen. You lost your funding, and you still can't tell the difference. I walked past the casket displays and out into the gray afternoon, and for about 48 hours, I actually believed that was the end of it. I believed I'd found the whole truth and walked away clean. Quick pause from the story. If you enjoy these stories, consider taking a listen to our Spotify show, linked in the description for early access to new stories in better audio quality. Now back to the video. 2 days after I walked out of that funeral home, my attorney called with a shaking voice and one sentence that undid everything I thought I understood. Elena, there's a second life insurance policy, one you didn't know about, and Vivian's name is already on it. My attorney's name is Renata Cole, and I'd hired her the same week I found the tablet. I found her through a coworker's referral, a family law attorney with a reputation for being unflinching, and I remember sitting in her waiting room that first Tuesday morning, still in the clothes I'd worn to the hospital, unsure whether I was there to file for divorce or simply to understand what I'd stumbled into. Renata had listened to the whole story without interrupting once, then set down her pen and said, "You're not just dealing with an affair, Elena. You're dealing with a family that had a plan. We need a plan too." I hired her on the spot, mostly to handle the accounts and whatever divorce paperwork I assumed I'd eventually need. Instead, 3 days after the funeral, she was walking me through probate documents at her office, and she pulled a form out of a folder that made my whole body go still. It was the Ridgeline Mutual policy, the one from that strange email thread I'd filed away in the back of my mind. $500,000, opened 14 months before Sean died. Primary beneficiary, Vivian Reyes. There's a spousal consent form attached, Renata said, sliding it across the desk. Most states require it for a policy like this when the applicant is married, it's supposed to be your signature. I looked down at the line at the bottom of the page. Elena Cabot, in blue ink, in handwriting that was almost mine. Almost. 14 years of reading fraudulent paperwork for a living had trained my eyes to catch exactly what almost meant. The slant was wrong, tilted 2 degrees further right than my natural hand ever goes. The loop on the E closed at the top, where mine always stays open. And the pressure was wrong too. Too even. Too careful. The kind of signature a person produces when they're copying something instead of signing it. I pulled out my phone with hands that weren't quite steady and found a document I'd signed the same month the policy was opened. Our mortgage refinance paperwork from that spring. I held the 2 signatures side by side on Renata's desk. They weren't the same hand. I never signed this, I said. I didn't even know this policy existed until you just told me. Renata's face didn't change much, which is how I knew she'd already suspected. There's a notary stamp here too. Frank Dolan. Do you know him? I did. Frank Dolan had notarized paperwork for Cabot & Sons for 20 years. He played golf with Howard every other Saturday. He'd been at our wedding. I checked the date on the notary stamp against my own calendar, the one I keep religiously for work, because compliance people live and die by dates. That exact day, I'd been 200 miles away in Cleveland, at a 3-day continuing education conference for mortgage regulation, with a hotel receipt, a parking receipt, and 40 coworkers who could confirm I never left the building. I hadn't signed that form. I hadn't been anywhere near a notary that day. Somebody had built my signature from scratch, walked it into Frank Dolan's office, and had it stamped as real. Renata pulled up a second document while I sat there, a benefits change form from Sean's employer file, Cabot & Sons' own HR records, filed around the same time. She turned her monitor toward me. There it was again, the same almost signature, the same closed loop on the E, the same too careful pressure, on a completely different document I'd never laid eyes on. Whoever had built that signature hadn't used it once. They'd used it as a template, ready whenever it was needed. How long do you think this took someone to plan? I asked, mostly to myself. Longer than a weekend, Renata said. This isn't the kind of thing you throw together after a bad phone call. Someone practiced this. I thought about every check Gwen had ever slid across a table toward Sean, every form she'd ever offered to help coordinate, every door she'd ever tried to walk through before I closed it. I understood sitting in that office that I hadn't caught a single impulsive act of grief. I'd caught the end of something that had been under construction for well over a year. I sat in Renata's office and understood all at once what that "she'll sign anything if you're sweet about it" message had actually meant. It wasn't just about the credit cards or the accounts. It was about this. Gwen had wanted me to sign off on a policy naming Vivian as beneficiary without ever reading it closely enough to notice what it was. When that plan didn't work, because I never signed it at all, somebody decided a real signature was optional. Before I left Renata's office, I asked her if I could make one call myself. She hesitated, then handed me the phone number for the Ridgeline Mutual agent listed on the policy, a woman named R. Castellano, whose name I recognized from that strange email thread I'd filed away months earlier. I dialed with Renata sitting across from me, taking notes. "I'm calling about a policy under my husband's name," I told the agent, keeping my voice level, the same voice I used for difficult calls at work. "I need to understand the circumstances under which it was opened." Castellano was cautious, professionally so, but she confirmed enough. The application had come in through a referral, she said, from an existing Ridgeline client. When I asked who that referring client was, she paused, checked something on her end, and told me, apologetically, that she wasn't able to share that without a formal records request. I didn't need her to say the name out loud. I already knew whose signature would be on that referral, and it wouldn't be a forgery this time. Gwen had been a Ridgeline policyholder herself for over a decade. Life insurance on Howard, the kind of detail that would have meant nothing to me a month earlier and meant everything to me now. I thanked her, hung up, and sat very still in Renata's office chair while that last piece settled into place. Gwen hadn't just tolerated the affair. She'd opened the door for the money behind it, using her own decades-old relationship with her own insurance company to make sure Vivian was set up before anyone ever thought to ask questions. I drove home that afternoon and sat in my car outside our house for 20 minutes before I could make myself go inside. I wasn't looking at a grieving family anymore. I was looking at a fraud file, and I knew exactly what to do with one of those, because I'd spent 14 years doing it for strangers. This time, it was mine to build. The next confrontation didn't happen in a funeral home. It happened 2 weeks later, in Renata's conference room, with Gwen's own attorney sitting beside her, because by then, Gwen had lawyered up the moment she heard the words, "insurance fraud investigation." The room was smaller than I expected, all beige carpet and a window looking out over a parking garage. Gwen wore a navy blazer I didn't recognize, the kind of outfit chosen specifically for a meeting like this, armor disguised as professionalism. Howard sat beside her, not next to her attorney, and I noticed the distance between his chair and hers before anyone said a word. I brought the side-by-side signatures, printed large enough that no one at the table could pretend not to see the differences. I brought my Cleveland hotel receipt. I brought a timeline Renata and I had built together, hour by hour, of exactly when that policy was opened, who the contact at Ridgeline Mutual had been, and who else had access to documents with my real signature on them. "This is a misunderstanding," Gwen said. The moment the folder hit the table, her voice pitched for an audience that wasn't there. "Sean handled our family's insurance. I had nothing to do with policy paperwork." Then explain the text message, I said. I slid a printed copy across the table. She'll sign anything if you're sweet about it. She always has. Sign what, Gwen? You wrote that 3 months before this policy was even opened. What were you already planning for me to sign? Her attorney put a hand on her arm. She shook it off. The same sharp motion I'd watched her use on Howard 100 times at 100 dinner tables. The reflex of a woman used to being obeyed rather than questioned. You have no idea what it's like, she said, to watch your son fall in love with someone who actually made him happy, while you sat there judging him for it. The room went completely still. Howard, who had barely spoken through the entire meeting, finally lifted his head. Gwen, he said quietly, you just admitted you knew. She turned on him, sharp as a blade. Don't you dare, Howard. Not now. You just said it in a room with 2 attorneys and a court reporter, he said. His voice was shaking, but it didn't stop. I sat next to you at that boy's funeral not knowing half of what you knew, not knowing about the girl, and God help me, not knowing about any policy. I need you to understand something, Gwen. I'm not lying for you. Not this time. Gwen's attorney tried to redirect. My client has cooperated fully with this process and denies any knowledge of. She just said she watched him fall in love with someone else and did nothing to stop it, I said, cutting in, my voice still level. That's not denial. That's a confession with better posture. Tyler didn't say anything at first. He just stared at the table, at the folder, at his own hands. Then quietly, almost to himself, I told her it was a bad idea. The signature. I told her someone would notice. The room turned to him. You knew, I said, not a question. I found out after, he said, not looking up. I didn't know until after it was already done. I should have told you. I've wanted to tell you for months. I looked at Gwen, who had gone very pale, her carefully built story collapsing in real time in front of the 2 people she'd needed most to keep it standing. I need you to hear this clearly, Gwen, I said, because I'm only going to say it once. This isn't about Vivian anymore. It stopped being about her the day someone forged my name on a legal document. That's not grief. That's not a mother protecting her son. That's a crime, and I intend to treat it like one. You'll destroy this family over paperwork, Gwen said, but her voice had lost the sharpness it started with. It came out smaller now, almost pleading. You destroyed this family, I said. I'm just the one holding the receipts. Her attorney asked for a recess. I didn't wait around for it. I stood, gathered my folder, and walked out of that conference room the same way I'd walked out of the funeral home. Except this time, nobody watching me had any doubt left about who I was or what I'd found. The weeks after that meeting spiraled in directions I hadn't fully prepared for, even with all my careful planning. I filed a formal complaint with Ridgeline Mutual's Fraud Investigation Unit, along with copies of the signature comparison, my Cleveland alibi, and a sworn affidavit. They froze the claim within a week and opened an internal investigation. A handwriting analyst they retained confirmed what I'd already seen with my own trained eyes. The signature on the spousal consent form was not a genuine match to any authentic sample of mine. My own family, such as it is, showed up in ways the Cabots never had. My sister Marin flew in from Chicago 4 days after the funeral home confrontation, took one look at me standing in my kitchen surrounded by folders, and started making a pot of coffee without asking whether I wanted any. She stayed a week. She didn't ask me to talk about it until I was ready, and when I finally was, somewhere around midnight on her 3rd night there, she sat across the table and let me lay every piece of it out, the tablet, the group chat, the signature, without once telling me I should try to move past it faster than I was moving. You don't have to forgive any of them, she said at one point. Just because they're the only in-laws you've got, you're allowed to just be done. It sounds like a small thing to say. It wasn't small to me. For 10 years, I'd absorbed the quiet expectation that being a good wife meant being endlessly patient with Gwen's version of family. Marin was the first person who said, plainly, that I was allowed to stop. The investigator assigned to the case, a methodical man named Preston, who spoke like he was reading off a checklist even when he wasn't, called me every few weeks with updates that meant more to me than he probably realized. He asked at one point how I'd caught the discrepancy so quickly, since most fraud like this went unnoticed for years. It's my job, I told him. I read documents for a living. I just never expected to be reading my own. He didn't have a response to that. Neither did I, really, beyond the fact that it was true. I also filed a police report, because forgery is a crime whether or not the family involved wants to think of it that way. A detective named Ruiz took my statement over 2 visits, methodical in her own way, cataloging dates and documents into a case file that would eventually sit on a prosecutor's desk. She told me near the end of the 2nd visit that cases like this rarely move fast. Paper trails take time, she said, but you've built us a good one. I thought of all the years I'd spent building trails like that for strangers, and how strange it felt to finally be building one that mattered to me. Frank Dolan lost his notary commission 3 months later, after admitting under questioning that Gwen had brought him a signed document and asked him to notarize it without me present, insisting I was running behind and had already signed. 20 years of trust, spent on a lie that took him maybe 4 minutes to tell. The county prosecutor's office eventually charged Gwen with forgery and insurance fraud, both felonies under state law once the amount involved crossed a certain threshold. I sat through 2 pre-trial hearings, watching her in a courtroom instead of a dining room for the first time in 10 years, watching the same posture she used to hold at the head of her table collapse a little more each time. Her attorney negotiated a plea eventually, a reduced charge in exchange for restitution, and a sentence of probation rather than prison. Largely, I was told, because of her age and lack of prior record. Part of me wanted more. A bigger part of me, the tired part, was simply relieved believed it was over, that a judge had said the word guilty out loud in a room full of people, and that no one could ever again call what happened a misunderstanding. Frank was never charged. The state board considered his conduct negligent rather than criminal, since he claimed credibly enough to the investigators that he genuinely believed I'd already signed before he stamped it. I don't know if I believe that. I know it cost him his commission either way, and I know he never played golf with Howard again. Vivian's claim on the $500,000 policy was voided entirely once the fraud was confirmed. I never spoke to her directly. I didn't need to. Whatever she believed about her place in Sean's life, she'd built it on the same rotten foundation as everything else, and it collapsed the same way. Gwen hired a different attorney and tried, briefly, to contest Sean's will, arguing that I'd coerced him during some undefined period of declining mental capacity that no doctor ever had documented. It didn't hold up. Renata dismantled it in a single filing. I don't think Gwen actually believed it would work. I think by then, she was just trying to make something, anything, cost me the way she felt she'd been cost. Her last real attempt came about 5 months after the funeral, on a Saturday morning, when she showed up unannounced at my new apartment building and buzzed my unit from the lobby before I'd even had coffee. I almost didn't answer. When I did, her voice came through the intercom smaller than I'd ever heard it, stripped of the performance she usually wore like a second outfit. I just want to talk, Elena. No lawyers, no folders, just you and me. Against my better judgment, I let her up, mostly because some old, tired part of me still wanted the conversation where she finally said something true. She stood in my doorway, looking smaller in my hallway than she'd ever looked at her own dinner table, and asked if there was any way to make this go away quietly, for the family's sake. There is no family, Gwen, I said. Not the way you mean it. There's an investigation now, and it isn't mine to make go away. You did that part yourself, a long time before I found out about any of it. She left without arguing, which told me more than any argument would have. Somewhere underneath all the performance, I think she finally understood the story had left her hands. That wasn't quite her last move, though. A few weeks before that visit, in the thick of the fraud investigation, my director at Heritage Bank called me into his office on a Wednesday morning, looking uncomfortable in a way I'd never seen from him in 14 years. Someone had called the main line, he said, identifying herself as a concerned family member, suggesting I was under significant emotional strain and might not be fit to handle sensitive compliance work right now. She hadn't left a name. She hadn't needed to. I told her we don't discuss personnel matters with outside callers, my director said, sliding a printed message slip across his desk, the caller ID number circled in pen. It matched Gwen's cell number exactly. For what it's worth, Elena, your work this quarter has been some of the cleanest I've seen from anyone on this floor. I don't know what's going on in your personal life, and it's not my business unless you want it to be, but I wanted you to know someone tried. I sat in his office and felt something shift in my chest, a mixture of fury and something almost like vindication. Gwen had spent 10 years treating my career like a hobby I'd eventually outgrow. Now, apparently, it had become dangerous enough to her narrative that she'd tried to burn it down entirely, on the theory that a woman without a paycheck might be easier to out-argue than one who wasn't. It didn't work. If anything, it hardened something in me that had still, embarrassingly, been holding out a small hope that some part of this could end without every bridge burning. That hope didn't survive the phone call. I can't say I mourned it for long. Cabot & Sons construction took its own quiet hit. Word travels fast in a town of 60,000 people who all go to the same 3 churches, and within 2 months, 2 of the company's oldest clients had quietly moved their contracts elsewhere. A subcontractor who'd worked with the family for 15 years told Howard, apparently without much tact, that he didn't want any part of whatever was going on with the Cabots right now. Howard relayed that conversation to me almost apologetically, like he expected me to feel sorry about it. I didn't. Not really. I'd spent too many years watching that family's name open doors it hadn't earned to mourn a few of those doors finally closing. The church community took its own sides, slower than the business did, but just as decisively. Patty called me again, months after our first conversation, this time to apologize properly, and to tell me that Gwen had quietly stopped attending Sunday services altogether, unable to sit through a sermon without feeling every eye in the room slide toward her. I felt no satisfaction in that, exactly. Mostly I felt tired, the way you feel after a long illness finally breaks. Relief without any real joy attached to it. I ran into Gwen myself only once after the plea hearing, in the parking lot of a grocery store on a Tuesday afternoon. She looked older than her 64 years, thinner, her carefully maintained composure worn down to something closer to just a tired woman pushing a cart. She saw me and stopped, and for a moment neither of us said anything. I hadn't planned to say anything to her at all. I'd assumed if we ever crossed paths again, I'd simply walk past, the way you walk past weather you can't control. But something in her face that afternoon, tired and unguarded in a way I'd never seen at any dinner table, made me stop anyway. I did love him, she finally said. Whatever else you think of me, I did love my son. I believe that, I said, and I meant it. I just don't think you ever figured out how to love anyone without also owning them a little. That includes him. It definitely included me. I said it plainly, without heat, the way you deliver a finding at the end of a long audit. It wasn't an accusation anymore by then. It was just the truth, filed and closed. She didn't have an answer for that. I didn't wait around for one. I loaded my groceries and drove home, and it was the last real conversation we ever had. Howard, for the first time in decades, started coming into the office without Gwen. He moved her desk out of the back office entirely, into to a smaller room down the hall, a change he described to me flatly, without elaboration, like a man reporting weather. He told me once, over coffee at a diner neither of us used to frequent, that he'd started reviewing every piece of paperwork himself now, reading contracts line by line the way he apparently should have been doing all along. I trusted the wrong person's signature for 30 years, he said. Never again. Howard became, against every expectation I'd had walking into that first meeting, the one member of that family who stayed. He called on my birthday. He came to the small service I eventually held, alone, at Sean's grave 6 months later, just the two of us and a bouquet of the kind of ordinary flowers Sean actually liked, not the funeral home's gold-trimmed excess. We didn't talk much. We didn't need to. He told me that day, standing over his son's grave in a coat too heavy for the weather, that he wished he'd said something the first time he suspected, years earlier than any of us realized, that something wasn't right. I saw a text once, he admitted, staring at the headstone instead of me, on his phone at a barbecue. I told myself it was nothing. I think some part of me always knew it wasn't. I didn't offer him forgiveness that day, because it wasn't mine to give, not for that particular failure, but I stood next to him anyway, in the cold, because grief doesn't always require forgiveness to be shared. Tyler cooperated fully with the fraud investigation, gave a statement that helped confirm the timeline, and moved out of his parents' orbit for the first time in his adult life. He got his own apartment, a small one-bedroom near the highway, the kind of place that would have made Gwen wince at a dinner table description. He got a real job, not one his family had arranged for him, doing inventory management for a distribution warehouse that had nothing to do with construction or his family's name. I ran into him once, months later, at a grocery store. Both of us caught off guard in the cereal aisle. He looked healthier than I'd ever seen him, steadier somehow, in a way that had nothing to do with weight or clothes and everything to do with the way he held himself. I keep thinking about that meeting, he said, apropos of nothing, standing there with a basket of groceries that looked like they belonged to someone building a real, ordinary life for the first time. I should have told you before any of it went that far. I knew about the affair for over a year before you found out. I just never thought it was my place. It wasn't your place to fix my marriage, I said. It was your place to tell the truth. Those aren't the same thing. He nodded, like he'd already arrived at that conclusion on his own, probably during one of the many long nights that new apartment near the highway must have given him. He sent me a text a few weeks after that just said, "I'm sorry. I should have been braver sooner." I didn't respond right away, but eventually I did. Some things deserve an answer, even a short one. The legitimate policy, the $150,000 through Sean's employer that had always named me as beneficiary, finally cleared probate about 8 months after his death, delayed by the broader investigation into the second policy. I didn't touch most of it right away. I let it sit in an account while I figured out what it meant to build a life out of money that had arrived because of a death instead of a plan. Eventually, I used a portion of it for the down payment on my new place, and put the rest into the kind of boring, diversified retirement account I'd have recommended to any client who asked me. Years of professional habit finally applied to my own life instead of everyone else's. Sean's grandmother, Eloise, 91 years old and sharper than half the family put together, called me once during that period, unprompted, from the memory care facility where she'd lived for the last few years. "I never liked how Gwen ran that house," she said, without preamble, her voice thin but certain. "You were always too good for the way they treated you." I should have said something sooner. I hadn't spoken to Eloise in over a year by then. I don't know how much of the situation she actually understood, given her condition, but the call meant more to me than most of the ones I got from people with full possession of their faculties. Somewhere in the middle of all of it, on a Sunday afternoon with nothing else to do, I sat on our bedroom floor and went through a box of Sean's old things: concert tickets from college, a photo of us at 23, sunburned and laughing on a lake dock, before any of this, before Gwen's money and Vivian's hotel receipts and a forged signature with my name on it, a birthday card he'd made me in our second year of marriage, misspelled and sincere, before he'd learned that store-bought was easier, and Gwen's approval mattered more than my laughing at his terrible handwriting. I found his old green jacket at the bottom of the box, the one from Ohio State, worn soft at the elbows. I held it for a long time without putting it on. I sat there for an hour and let myself grieve the version of him that existed in that photo, the one who used to leave notes on the bathroom mirror in dry erase marker, just to make me smile before work, notes that had stopped coming somewhere around year 7 without my ever noticing the exact day they ended. That man was gone long before his heart actually stopped. I think I'd known that for longer than I wanted to admit. In the same quiet way you know a house has a leak somewhere before you ever find the water stain. Grieving him meant grieving two different losses at once: the husband I lost to a stranger's apartment, and the husband I'd already been losing for years before that, one small absence at a time. There was no folder, no signature analysis, no fraud investigation that could untangle those from each other. Some things you just have to sit inside of until they hurt less. I kept the jacket. I gave the rest of the box to a donation center a few weeks later, all but the lake dock photo, which I kept in a drawer, not on display, not hidden either, just kept. The way you keep proof that something good was real once, even if it didn't stay that way. It's been a little over a year now. I still work at Heritage Bank. I got promoted, actually, to a director-level compliance role, the kind of job that would have made younger me proud in a way that has nothing to do with anyone else's approval. I moved out of the house on Larchmere Court and and bought a smaller place across town, closer to work. With a kitchen window that catches the morning light instead of the evening shadows, Gwen's $40,000 had somehow always cast over that first house. I still see Howard every couple of months. We don't talk about Gwen much. He's living alone now in a house that's technically still his, though I understand the divorce filing went through without much fight from either side. I don't ask for details. Some things aren't mine to carry anymore. I've started running again, something I gave up years ago somewhere in the busy middle of my marriage, back when Sunday mornings belonged to Cabot family breakfasts, instead of my own quiet routines. I run a loop through a park near my new place, past a pond where the same 3 ducks always seem to be arguing about something, and I've found that the miles are where most of my remaining anger finally goes to burn off. I don't think about the funeral home on those runs anymore. Not really. Mostly I think about the route and the weather, and whether I'll stop for coffee after. I made a friend at work, a woman named Deborah in the legal department, who started eating lunch with me sometime during the worst of the investigation, back when I could barely get through a meal without checking my phone for updates from Renata or Detective Ruiz. She never asked more than I wanted to share. She just showed up week after week with her turkey sandwich and her dry sense of humor, until eventually I realized I looked forward to those lunches more than almost anything else in my week. It turns out that's what an actual family, chosen rather than married into, can look like. Small, unglamorous, reliable in the ways that matter. I haven't started dating. I don't know if I will anytime soon. For a long time after everything settled, I was afraid that meant something was still broken in me, some capacity for trust that Gwen and Sean and Vivian had used up between the 3 of them. Renata told me once, over a final closing meeting about the estate, that it wasn't broken, just resting. I've decided to believe her. There's no case file to build on that one, just time, the same slow accumulation of ordinary days that got me this far already. I never got the family I thought I was building. No children came from those years, and there's a particular kind of quiet grief in that which never fully resolves, just settles into something you learn to live around instead of through. I've made peace with it as much as a person can. Not the peace of forgetting, the peace of no longer needing an explanation from anyone who was never going to give me an honest one. Some nights I still catch myself reaching for my phone to tell Sean something small and ordinary, a funny thing that happened at work, a show I think he'd like, before I remember there's no one on the other end of that impulse anymore. Those moments used to wreck me. Now they mostly just pass, quick and dull, like stepping on a stair that isn't there anymore in a house you've since moved out of. Grief gets quieter. It doesn't leave. It just learns to sit in the corner instead of the middle of the room. Here's the truth I took the longest to accept. I spent 10 years married to a man whose family believed love and ownership were the same thing. A gift with strings. A signature on a form nobody actually asked me to sign, because they'd already decided what I'd agree to before I ever got the chance to answer for myself. Gwen handed a funeral director my credit card like she owned it because, in every way that mattered to her, she believed she always had. The house, the marriage, the story of what kind of daughter-in-law I was supposed to be, grateful and quiet and easy to move around. She was wrong. It just took me longer than I would have liked to prove it. I don't tell this story for sympathy. I tell it because somewhere out there is a woman sitting on a bathroom floor at 3 in the morning, reading messages she was never supposed to find, wondering if she's crazy for seeing what she's seeing. You're not. Trust the version of yourself that reads the fine print. Trust the version of yourself that notices the signature doesn't quite match. I lost a husband that Thursday night in a stranger's apartment, and I lost a family I'd spent a decade trying to belong to, and both of those losses are real, and they still ache on the right kind of quiet evening. But I walked out of that funeral home with a folder full of truth and a card that no longer belonged to anyone but me, and somewhere in the year since, that turned out to be the only inheritance that actually mattered. Some mornings I still stand at that kitchen window longer than I need to, coffee in hand, watching the light move across the counter the way it does when a day is about to be ordinary. Those are the mornings I trust the most now, not the dramatic ones, the quiet, boring, unremarkable ones, stacked one on top of another until they finally outnumber all the ones that came before. Nobody owns me now. Not a family that never wanted me. Not a marriage that stopped being real long before it ended. Just me in a kitchen with good morning light, finally signing my name the way I've always signed it. No one copying it. No one needing it to look like something it isn't. Just mine.